I got a crazy teacher who wears dark glasses. Things are going great, and they're only getting better.
Hi, this is Dr. Bain, and this is another element of our management background. And this segment focuses on the Hawthorne Studies that have been associated with Elton Mayo. Mayo is an Australian-born citizen who studied in Melbourne, if I remember correctly, Australia. And he wasn't able to get the teaching position that he wanted. And that led him to say, all right, I'm going to England. And on my way, I'm going to stop in the U.S. and see what's going on over there. He had scheduled a visit to San Francisco. Poor guy landed on the ground, and almost immediately people were asking him to come and speak here, go speak there. And he had actually honed his public speaking skills and really valued that. So not only was he a guy who had a lot to say and really insightful things about how what happens in the workplace affects productivity, but he was good at explaining it to people. Eventually, after some of that public speaking, the University of Pennsylvania, based on a grant from Rockefeller, got him, and at Pennsylvania, he did a study on rest pauses in productivity, meaning a break. How long does a person pause to get an increase in productivity, for example? What he found was that it improved productivity. Not a great shock there. What happened, though, was these pauses got instituted into the usual work day, and foremen, when Mayo was gone, would remove them from the work day. And so, just imagine, oh, thank gosh, thank goodness, Dr. Mayo is here. We get to take a few seconds off now and then. Oh, Dr. Mayo's gone. The foremen are going to work him to death without a moment to breathe, right? So this back and forth eroded trust. It eroded job satisfaction for all kinds of reasons. Eventually, there was a dramatic decrease in productivity. And the work that Mayo did at University of Pennsylvania led to sort of the thesis of all the work that Mayo did for the better part of the rest of his life. And that thesis is treat employees humanely. Eventually, Mayo went to Harvard and started doing some work there where he wanted to, do more about what is having an effect on the physical and psychological welfare of employees. What's happening in workplaces to have an effect on employees. Wasn't long after he'd been there that Western Electric asked him for his opinion on some research they had. And what they had discovered in their research was not exactly counter, but not parallel enough to Mayo's University of Pennsylvania research for them to feel okay about it. So they said, look, you found that taking a pause, having a rest, can improve productivity. What we found was that it does both. So what's going on? And he said, my guess is that attitude is part of the explanation. So Western Electric began a large-scale research program to try to assess attitudes about work. Of course, Mayo became interested, and as part of the first study included some interviewing, and he started participating in helping to prepare the interviewers. Because of his background in psychology and psychotherapy, he knew a lot about listening, and he spent a lot of time teaching people what are essentially the same good listening practices of psychotherapists today. That first study is called the Illumination Study. And what they would do is they were looking for what kind of lighting was optimal for worker output. In one room, the light was constant, so they had a control. And in another room, the light was increased and it was decreased. Okay? In both rooms, output increased. Now, mind you, they interviewed the people who were participating in this program, okay, in the Illumination Study, whether they were in the control room or the room where the lighting was increased and decreased. In both rooms, output increased, but there was not a significant difference. You would normally have expected, that's why we call it control, that there'd be a significant difference, usually, between control room and output room, or, variable room. But there wasn't. Both rooms went up. Within a year of that time, Mayo was overseeing the entire program of over 10,000 employees, and it eventually bloomed a little bit more than that, and there were over 20,000 people involved. He used his interest and background in psychotherapy and spent years at a place called Hawthorne Works of the Western Electric Company in Chicago, Illinois. Out of this, he eventually published with Roethlisberger and Dixon a book called Management and the Worker. And it is the foundation of today's management, just like Taylor's is, except this piece plays a huge role in what we call more of a human relations approach. So let's take a look at the studies a little bit more. The second study that they ran is called the Relay Assembly Study. In this study, there were five females who assembled telephone relays. There were 35 small parts, and they put them all together. They manipulated all kinds of factors: hours, rest, time of day, pay, talk among workers. Productivity and satisfaction increased regardless of what changes were made. They decided that it must be the supervisory practices that were creating the change in output and in worker satisfaction. So they designed another study, and this one was called the interviewing program. They did interviews of workers, and lots and lots of workers, and just because they were talking to them, what I really mean is just because they were listening to them. People said, "I feel better already," just because someone is listening. So by the time they finished that one, there were over 21,000 people who had participated. They took all of that information and designed what turned out to be the final study in the Hawthorne experiments. And it's called the bank wiring room observation. Okay, they designed it as a result of the others. And social groups will have some control over production of the individual. This was the idea. Is that what's happening, they said? Is there a form of informal leadership operating that restricts or encourages employee output? There were 14 bank wiremen, and they completed their own individual tasks, although they were separated from the rest of the workers. They did not know the nature of the study, and there was a researcher in the room who acted like a disinterested observer. Each worker artificially restricted his own output. In fact, output was lower than company-established targets. What was happening was they were informally imposing group norms. Informal organization can constrain employee behavior. This was the first time through data that anyone had discovered that their informal networks, informal power structures, play a role in productivity and efficiency. That was the finding from the bank wiring study. All right, what did we learn overall? Well, the illumination study led to the notion that just observing people's behavior can alter their behavior. And that is what is now known as the Hawthorne effect. How did it get translated? Pay attention to your workers, even just a little bit, and you might increase satisfaction and productivity. From the relay assembly test room, what happened was management began, as a result of what we learned from this study, to change how they interacted. It affected human relationships between workers and up and down the vertical chain. Prior to that, it was not really considered that relationships in the workplace were of any use or of any influence. So we learned that they were of use and of influence, although we didn't know too much about it. from this study. In the interviewing program, we learned that upward communication from the worker to the person he or she works for, can play a huge role in attitudes and satisfaction and productivity. And from the bank wiring study, future theorists, not right away, began to account for the existence of informal communication. Remember that Taylor and Fayol and Weber, they really didn't pay any attention to communication and didn't even acknowledge it, much less consider whether it had any function and how well the organization worked. But from the bank wiring study, we finally realized that communication, upward and horizontal, can play a role in organizations. And again, future theorists started exploring what role that was. The Hawthorne Studies as a whole represented a major turning point, huge, in management theory and the foundation of what we do to manage people and lead people today. They were the trigger for understanding the role, for researchers to begin understanding the role of communication in effective management. Okay, that covers it for the Hawthorne Studies. Thanks for your time.
Only getting better.